Let's start with all the tariff chaos because China says it will fight to the end after President Trump threatened to increase tariffs on Beijing even further. Donald Trump has said that if China doesn't remove the 34% tariffs it's threatened in response to his earlier tariffs, he would impose a further 50% tax. That would see Chinese imports into the US facing a total tariff of 104%. Well, that's the opening bell. It comes with the backdrop where we are a day away from the country-specific tariffs coming into effect. In Europe and Asia, the stock markets have made gains but are still well down after last week's announcement and days of market turmoil. Well, Donald Trump's trade representative is still being questioned on Capitol Hill on the tariff policy. Jamieson Greer defended the president's policy and told senators that almost 50 countries had reached out to make a deal. Well, let's hear more of what has been said in that cross-examination because Senator Ron Wyden asked if the tariffs will go into effect tomorrow as previously announced.
Yes, they're scheduled to go into effect. We are having negotiations with all kinds of countries at this time. The president's fixed in his purpose. The nature of the emergency that I discussed earlier is not something we can wait on anymore. So we will have the president's plan go into effect, and we're coupling that with immediate negotiations with our partners as they seek to.
So it's not a question of something being scheduled. You're committing this morning that they're going to go into effect.
This is what the president has said, Senator.
For how many countries? I understand it's over 50.
That are negotiating with us. We have about 50 that have come to speak with us, and I'm constantly talking to my counterparts. I have staff right now at USTR meeting with others, and we will have the tariffs in place. And if the other countries can come to an agreement on reciprocal trade, then that's something that the president can consider. I don't want to prejudge the negotiations or the president's decision, but that's what we're doing.
Well, just some of the key exchanges. Let me tell you that session is still continuing on Capitol Hill. We'll continue to monitor what is happening and bring you anything that is important in the questions and answers. But whilst that has been going on, speaking to Parliament's liaison committee here in London, the UK's Prime Minister has said we need to keep our options on the table when responding to the US trade tariffs.
I'm obviously very disappointed to see tariffs in place. I don't think that they are good for our economy or for economies around the world. My instinct is that we shouldn't jump in with both feet to retaliate. So in that sense, I'm not changing my plans. I think calm, collected response. Obviously, we have to keep our options on the table and do the preparatory work for retaliation if necessary. But I think that trying to negotiate an arrangement which mitigates the tariffs is better.
Well, let's speak to our political correspondent, Hannah Miller, who's been listening to that exchange and a lot of questions, obviously, on tariffs and other areas. But tell me more of the sorts of questions and answers put to the UK Prime Minister and more of his thinking here.
Yeah, I mean, on tariffs in particular, Matthew, he said that he was disappointed to see them, describe the last few days as very challenging, as well as the clip that you just heard of Keir Starmer there. He was asked whether there might be any support for British businesses along the lines of the support that was given during the COVID pandemic. And I mean, essentially the answer to that was no, not in that kind of form, although it was very clear from the speech that he gave yesterday that the way the government is thinking here is about kind of shaping British industrial strategy and trying to support certain sectors to boost jobs and sort of accepting that these tariffs are here to stay, it seems, as much as they are trying to negotiate them away, accepting that they may now be a reality and trying to kind of boost the economy in that sense. He was also asked questions about a whole array of issues from welfare, foreign aid, social care as well. In some ways, I have to say, at this particular committee, the questions were perhaps more interesting than some of the answers. We've got used to these liaison committees in the days of Boris Johnson being kind of moments with great say, fireworks, and there weren't really any of those today. He managed to kind of deal with a lot of the questions in quite a calm way, commit to writing to the committee sometimes if he wasn't sure of the answer, but no kind of huge moments, as it were, from this committee so far.
Quick final thought, Hannah. In terms of that list of retaliatory measures, obviously he is saying that he doesn't want to impose that yet and will give room for the sort of talks and negotiations. But how long is he prepared to have that as the position before he decides, well, there's no progress on the trade talks, there's no change in US policy on these tariffs, so we will think about introducing retaliatory measures?
I mean, I think that is a key question that hasn't really been answered. The government is consulting with businesses in the UK about the impact of possible retaliatory tariffs, kind of asking them what the knock-on impacts might be in an attempt to sort of get it right. I don't get any sense that they really want to go down that route, and they certainly haven't set a deadline as to when they would introduce those kinds of things. The Prime Minister's engagement has been a lot with other countries trying to warn against any idea of a trade war or the kinds of measures that you're seeing going on between China and the US. He certainly wants to avoid that, is encouraging other countries to avoid that. So I think the idea that they're going to put a kind of timeline on when they would retaliate is something that's pretty unlikely at the moment.
Hannah, thanks very much. Hannah Miller there at Westminster. Let's head and talk to our New York business correspondent, Erin Delmore, who's been keeping an eye on the markets, but also keeping an eye on that session in Washington. Very interesting that Jameson Greer was asked by the lead Democrat a really straightforward question. Are these tariffs that are going to come in for so many different countries tomorrow, is that still happening? And he got a very clear answer. Yes, it was. No exceptions.
Right, and he said that's what the president intends. Now, what senators are focused on in this committee here is any space, any room that there might be for any kind of negotiation with these countries. And you did hear Senator Ron Wyden trying to nail down the timing. Will these go into effect tomorrow? And I do wonder how much space there is in that answer. It was clear, as you said, Matthew, but at the same time, Jameson Greer talked about conversations with more than 50 countries that, for me, actually, were pretty eyebrow-raising. He said, we've told them, the other countries, if you have a better idea to achieve reciprocity and get our trade deficits down, we want to talk to you. If you have an alternative plan, we're open to that. Now, that does sound like a real olive branch, a real negotiating opening line, the message that this administration is putting forward to other countries. And I do wonder if they are only circling around trade or if they're open to some other deficit reduction measures from other countries. Certainly, you know, there is some sparring during this hearing as well, and a lot of focus on China. And it does seem from Jameson Greer's testimony that China is not on the president's radar to negotiate with chiefly right now.
What's your reading of the markets? Have they factored in already all the things that we're likely to see tomorrow, or are we likely to see another sea of red? And it was interesting in the questions there to Mr. Greer that a lot of focus on ordinary Americans, on their pension pots, on jobs, on prices, because that is a real pressure that is coming on all politicians of all stripes.
Right. And Jameson Greer speaks for the administration here. And I heard him putting forward a line that we have heard from President Trump going back to the campaign trail, talking about, as you say, American workers, American manufacturing. But he said clearly this has to be a country that produces goods. And Matthew, the reason why I bring it up is because when we see the deficit totals that were calculated by the administration, they seem to have stripped out services and really just focused on goods that are imported and exported to achieve their numbers here. And he said we need to be making things in this country from a worker standpoint, a hiring standpoint, from a national security standpoint. And he really tapped on this moment back in 2020 when the U.S. found itself unable in its supply chains to get critical materials and the goods that were needed. He really tried to pull on that in his testimony to say, remember, we've been through this. That's the national security objective that the Trump administration speaks of. But Matthew, there are a lot of objectives in this plan right now. There's a plan to raise revenue off of what President calls a reciprocal or a more level tariff structure. But there's also a priority of bringing jobs back to the United States. And something senators are trying to get to the bottom of is, are we trying to generate more revenue off of trade, or are we trying to eschew that path and instead try to make things here? It's a dichotomy, and they're really trying to get to the bottom of what the president's goal here and the timing of the tariffs.
Erin, Great stuff. Thanks very much. We'll talk again in the coming hours. We will continue again to monitor that session. It was interesting in that session, Jameson Greer talking about the difference between the various countries that are making contact with the Trump administration to have conversations, perhaps to negotiate. And he drew an absolute contrast to the approach from Beijing. And we saw Beijing and China really in the Trump administration's crosshairs again in the questions and answers. Well, Sean Wan is our reporter in our Global China unit, and he gave me his analysis of the Chinese response so far to President Trump's tariffs.
I think, as what we've heard so far, China this time around has really come out in a very firm stance, very different from previous occasions. This is not the first time Trump has slapped tariffs on Chinese goods. In previous rounds, China has been able to sort of retaliate very cautiously, for example, 10% on agriculture goods, or taking this case to WTO, all those sort of things. But this time around, China is saying that, you know what, we're going to put our foot down and we're going to impose another 34% of retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. So that is quite a strong stance.
What we haven't had is, I mean, this is moving so quickly. Yesterday we had Donald Trump saying because of all of that, they're going to put another 50% tariffs on China. We haven't had a response from Beijing on that. If there is a similar response, that sort of 50% tariff going the other way, what are the sort of things that Beijing might target?
That's sort of a guessing game right now, right? But Beijing does have a lot of tools in its arsenal. For example, the first one, Trump was saying at the very beginning, the reason why Trump was slamming those tariffs on Chinese goods is because he wanted the negotiation about fentanyl to start. Washington accuses Beijing of supplying precursor materials to fentanyl. So one of the things that Beijing could do is just completely drop out of that negotiation. And second of all, when it comes to economic nature stuff, it could impose more tariffs on agriculture goods, which is the major imports coming in from the U.S. to China. And China was also mulling the idea, for example, completely banning poultry from the U.S. And soybeans. All those sort of things are very important.
And rare minerals, that is being talked about openly now,
Exactly. And China's threatening of completely banning rare earth mineral to the U.S., which is significantly important for manufacturing a lot of goods in the U.S. as well.
Now, Donald Trump wants to completely change the way trade works, especially with China. In terms of the Chinese economic model, that is based largely on exports, isn't it? So
Right.
Is there any likelihood of the capacity to change Beijing's thinking?
It is important to acknowledge that, as you said earlier, exports do play a major role in China's economy. For example, last year alone, 20% of China's GDP came from exports. So by sort of focusing on tariffs, that's going to hurt China's economy a lot. But at the same time, China might have a lot of tools to sort of evade that problem as well. For example, it does have a very sluggish domestic consumer confidence. So what it's trying to do is probably try to boost domestic consumption, while at the same time, instead of dumping the goods to third countries, they might well start collaborating with other countries to start their manufacturing in other countries as well.
So in a sense, building on the Belt and Road policy we know they've followed over the last few years. We know of the influence, the investment in Africa, for example. Right. So in a sense, try to exploit all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, the U.S., China has actually reduced its reliance on the American market. From 2017, over 20% of China's exports went to the U.S. Now it's below 15%. So by focusing on countries in Africa, for example, the Southeast Asia, China is going to be able to explore other options.
That was Sean Wan from our Global China unit. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.